I was at a small dinner party recently, and the conversation, turned to Ridley Scott's latest Napoleon biopic. And one guy there, a self-proclaimed history buff, he got visibly agitated.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he wasn't just annoyed. He was personally offended. He kept pacing around, glass in hand, ranting about how the film slandered a visionary and dirtied the memory of a hero.
Wow.
His face was flushed with this kind of protective zeal you'd usually see from a diehard fan defending, a pop star, not a 19th century general. To him, Napoleon was the ultimate man of destiny, a figure of pure, unadulterated brilliance who saved France.
That's a common view, the great man theory of history.
It is. But what was fascinating was his reaction when I brought up the fact that the French people, the same ones who had just spilled oceans of blood to behead their king and queen, cheered as this hero effectively ended their democracy and put on a crown himself.
Right. The central contradiction.
Exactly. I asked him, if they hated monarchy so much, why did they practically beg for an emperor? And he paused for a second. His expression just shifted from this righteous anger to a sort of strained silence.
He didn't have a good answer.
He eventually muttered something about stability and the glory of the nation, but the conviction in his voice had, flickered. It struck me then that we often talk about Napoleon as if he were a force of nature, a genius who just bent history to his will.
Mm-hmm.
But that narrative, it hides a much more cynical and maybe more modern reality. We forget that the man who became the symbol of French pride started out as a Corsican nationalist who despised France. We overlook that his unstoppable rise wasn't just about his talent on the battlefield, but about a very specific kind of political opportunism, a wolf warrior style of diplomacy that used external enemies to crush internal dissent. That instantaneous shift from revolutionary liberator to absolute dictator, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It makes you wonder. Was Napoleon truly the hero history remembers, or was he just a master at riding a wave of nationalistic fever that the people were all too eager to drown in? To understand the man, we have to look past the epic battles and the grand paintings and ask ourselves why a nation that fought for freedom was so quick to trade it all for a seat at the feet of a strong man. Okay, so let's really unpack this central paradox. You've got this nation, brand new, supposedly liberated from the Bourbon tyranny, and then they willingly embrace an emperor. Was Napoleon's rise truly just about his personal genius, or does his story reveal a kind of recurring blueprint for modern authoritarianism?
I think it's very much the blueprint.
A cycle where the foreign threat is expertly weaponized to crush domestic dissent and centralize executive power.
That tension trading liberty for security and glory is precisely what we need to explore in this deep dive. We are essentially connecting the dots between historical political opportunism, like we see with Napoleon, and contemporary political dynamics.
Okay.
We're exploring the exact mechanisms behind democratic erosion and, critically, how that unchecked centralization of power translates directly into highly hostile and risky foreign policy behavior. For you, the key takeaway here is knowledge and its application. Understanding these mechanisms allows you to identify when a domestic political crisis is being manufactured or at least leveraged for geopolitical gains.
Let's start with Napoleon's ascent then, because it seems his political identity was far more fluid than we usually give him credit for.
Yeah.
We know he started as a Corsican nationalist who initially despised France. How did he pivot from that to becoming the ultimate symbol of French nationalism?
It's a remarkable study in political transformation. I mean, Napoleon Bonaparte was born in Corsica in 1769, which was shortly after the island was purchased and annexed by France.
So he wasn't really French culturally.
Not at all. He grew up fundamentally aligning himself with the Corsican independence movement. His early loyalty was not to Paris, but to his homeland. He was an outsider.
Structurally an outsider to the French system, at least.
Absolutely. But then the French Revolution erupts in 1789. This event just fundamentally alters the entire political landscape. It creates profound domestic chaos, but also a terrifying external threat.
Right, because once the monarchy was overthrown and, executed, France immediately faced this anti-French coalition.
Of all the surrounding feudal states, Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, all of whom were horrified that these revolutionary Republican ideas would infect their own populations.
So the new republic was surrounded. This wasn't just a political challenge, it was an existential one.
It was life or death for the new French Republic. And in that atmosphere of existential threat, France desperately needed military heroes who could defend the fragile fruits of the revolution.
That power vacuum.
A huge one. And Napoleon, who had genuine, if nascent, military ability, particularly as an artillery officer, he recognized this vacuum. His string of major military victories victories, especially the spectacularly successful Italian campaign of 1796-1797, transformed him overnight.
So he went from being this obscure provincial general into this necessary shield for the revolution.
Exactly. The political rewards for his success against the anti-French coalition immediately superseded his ideological past. The moment he became the face of French military success, his identity shifted, or was politically shifted, from Corsican nationalist to I am the embodiment of the French Republic.
The external threat provided the perfect stage for his self-promotion and, I guess, popular adoration.
The perfect stage. And you have to look at what was happening inside France that made the population so receptive to a strongman.
Right, the internal situation.
The country was utterly exhausted. The early promise of the revolution had descended into the chaos and bloodshed of the Reign of Terror, led by the Jacobins. Estimates suggest around 40,000 citizens were executed.
40,000.
We're talking about a period where over 100 heads were, on some days, rolling off the guillotine in Paris alone.
That level of internal instability must have been psychologically devastating for the common person.
It was paralyzing. If you look at accounts from, say, minor Parisian officials or clerks during that late 1790s period, people who had witnessed the revolution devour its own architects, they describe a city traumatized not just by the internal terror, but by the looming shadow of foreign armies.
The anti-French coalition was massing on the borders.
Exactly. So you're facing that combination of domestic terror and foreign invasion. The desire for liberty suddenly becomes secondary to the desire for plain old survival.
We were desperate.
They were. And so when Napoleon began to bypass the chaotic, corrupt Directory government and consolidate power, culminating in the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, the public didn't protest the loss of democracy. Many accounts show they cheered.
They were willing to trade the messiness and the terror of a fragile democracy for the perceived stability, the ironclad certainty of a nationalist savior.
That's a perfect way to put it. The idea that the outside world is the enemy is the perfect mechanism for handing the keys over to the strongman. The fear of invasion justifies the internal power grab.
It's the core of the strongman paradox.
Yeah, it is. By 1804, Napoleon crowned himself emperor, explicitly restoring the monarchical system that the nation had just spent years violently overthrowing. The collective fear of foreign invasion, combined with the exhaustion from internal violence, created a nationalistic fervor that made the population eager to accept the strongman who promised protection and decisive victory.
So let's move from that historical example to today. How does that strongman playbook look now? We often think of autocracy arising from, a sudden military coup. But modern evidence suggests democratic backsliding is a much more subtle, almost legal process.
That subtlety is exactly what makes modern democratic erosion so insidious. Scholars call it executive aggrandizement. It's defined as the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions and norms by elected executives, often using completely legal means.
So it's not tanks in the streets. It's legislative tinkering and judicial appointments.
Exactly. They use the rules of the game against the game itself.
A death by 1,000 paper cuts.
It is. As political scientist Nancy Bermeo describes it, backsliding is incremental. Leaders weaken checks on power one by one, undertaking institutional changes that make it harder for the opposition to effectively challenge them. They consolidate power entirely through legal and constitutional means, altering the rules so cleverly that accountability becomes dangerously meaningless.
And long-standing institutions, even in established democracies, they must struggle to respond to a clever politician who knows how to use the legal system against democracy itself.
They do. It's incredibly difficult to fight.
So the goal is to make the power grab look legitimate by cloaking it in laws and procedure.
Yeah.
What are the key institutions they target first?
The process generally involves neutralizing 3 key structural checks on executive power. The first is the legislature.
The lawmaking body.
Right. If the executive can secure a compliant majority, they can shut down the legislature's ability to conduct any real oversight or block appointments. The executive then gets to legislate new laws that further benefit their party and solidify their hold on power.
So in Russia, for instance, Putin's United Russia Party has repeatedly captured these supermajorities.
Yes, giving the president unchecked control over federal legislation, high-level appointments, and even critical constitutional amendments. It effectively turns the legislative body into a rubber stamp for the executive's will.
A rubber stamp.
Precisely. And we see similar tactics in Turkey under President Erdogan. His party, the AKP, leveraged parliamentary strength to pass a record number of new often controversial laws and constitutional referendums, gradually restructuring the political system around presidential power.
The key is using the strength you gained in a free election to dismantle the system that allowed you to win in the first place.
That's the playbook. And once the lawmaking body is neutralized, the courts are next.
Right, because they are the ultimate check on constitutionality.
The judiciary is the critical second target. Autocrats use their control over the legislature to pack the courts with loyalists or to manipulate the system to sideline opponents. This move insulates the leader from legal pushback and allows them to weaponize the courts against political adversaries, criminalizing opposition or protecting their own from corruption charges.
So what are some of the clever ways this judicial neutralization has been achieved legally?
The tactics are often bureaucratic but devastatingly effective. Look at Hungary under Viktor Orban. He used the legislature to introduce two major changes. First, he drastically reduced the retirement age for judges from 70 to 62.
Wow, okay. That's completely legal.
Completely legal, but it created sudden mass vacancies across the judicial system, which he then filled with his own loyalists. Second, he increased the size of the Constitutional Court from 11 to 17.
Again, to pack it.
Both were legal structural changes designed specifically to pack the highest court and ensure party control over any constitutional challenges. It's a very sophisticated way to conduct a purge using a retirement age change to get rid of entrenched independent judges.
It really is.
Another famous example is Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He similarly oversaw the expansion of the Supreme Court from 20 to 72 members, filling those new vacancies exclusively with political allies. By controlling the mechanism of appointment and the size of the court, the strongman removes the only institutional body capable of reversing their power grabs.
And the third check, which is more societal than institutional, is the media.
The press and media are absolutely vital for accountability. Would-be autocrats consistently engage in strategies to vilify, discredit, or simply acquire the press, often portraying independent journalism as the enemy of the people.
That sounds familiar.
This allows them to control the national narrative and rule with impunity because critical information simply doesn't reach the populace or is dismissed as fake news.
I think we've seen all these strategies deployed globally.
Absolutely. You have the direct acquisition of media, historically typified by Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. Then you have direct state control over public media, combined with the outright silencing or harassment of independent voices, which is common in Russia and China.
And then there's the third way.
And finally, you have the strategy of dominating the public conversation by constantly calling into question the legitimacy of major news outlets, thereby diminishing their authority to hold the executive accountable. The goal is always the same: eliminate the flow of information that could organize effective opposition.
So once this internal centralization is complete, once the domestic checks are legally dismantled, does that inevitably translate into a more hostile stance on the global stage? Is getting rid of accountability at home a trigger for aggression abroad?
Empirically, yes. The data shows a quantifiable correlation. Leaders of backsliding democracies are significantly more likely to engage in conflictual international behavior compared to non-backsliding counterparts. Because the strongman has neutralized the domestic costs of failure, so they have every incentive to provoke international discord.
What drives that incentive? Why does a lack of accountability at home make a leader riskier abroad?
There are three powerful reinforcing reasons that compel a backsliding leader toward conflictual foreign policy. First is the need to be the champion of the people.
The protector.
Taking bold, provocative action against foreign states allows the leader to constantly remind their support base of their willingness to fight aggressively for national interests. It reaffirms their identity as the populist protector. It's pure political theater designed to distract and galvanize.
Right.
Remember Donald Trump's comments during the trade wars against China in 2019, where he declared, "I am the chosen one," implying he was uniquely mandated to fight these international battles. The act of picking a fight puts the leader center stage.
It reinforces the narrative that they, and only they, are standing up to the international foe.
Exactly. The second reason is executive primacy. Foreign policy is the domain where the executive's power is most inherent and least questioned. They are the commander-in-chief and control the diplomatic corps.
And while the legislative branch theoretically has the power of the purse, controlling funding,
wielding that lever against a military action already underway is politically costly and incredibly difficult.
Because no politician wants to be accused of withdrawing funding from troops fighting a foreign enemy.
Correct. The conflict atmosphere elevates the importance of the executive as the ultimate decider relative to the very institutions they have already weakened. It highlights the executive's indispensable role, justifying their centralization of power.
Okay, so what's the third reason?
And the third and perhaps most crucial reason is the crisis atmosphere and rally effect. International conflict, particularly anything involving actual physical violence or significant military tension, generates a domestic rally-round-the-flag atmosphere,
Which universally bolsters the executive's public support.
And crucially, it effectively silences domestic opposition, who are pressured to stand united against the foreign enemy. It's the ultimate deflection. If the focus is on the external threat, nobody is looking at the internal consolidation of power. If the leader can successfully portray the international threat as existential like the anti-French coalition did for Napoleon, it overshadows any domestic happenings or corruption scandals. In the most extreme cases, this crisis atmosphere allows the leader to put emergency powers in place, further cementing control.
A move that is often readily accepted by a public, polarized into an you says them mentality.
It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Neutralize internal checks legally, then use external threats to create a crisis that justifies even greater internal centralization and unquestioned executive power.
That brings us right back to Napoleon. He perfected this cycle using external war to justify absolute internal power. I mean, he conquered most of continental Europe, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, and even forced Russia to ally with him after 1807. His empire looked invincible, but it failed. So if a strongman achieves that level of tactical dominance, why can't he maintain it?
Napoleon's story is a foundational lesson in the limits of military hegemony. He committed a fundamental strategic error. He mistook dominance for stability. His undisputed tactical genius winning battles that seemed mathematically impossible was unmatched, but he utterly lacked the long-term vision for political and economic integration.
So the military victories were unsustainable because they weren't matched by a viable political and economic strategy.
Exactly. I mean, consider the perspective of the soldiers on the ground. When you read accounts from veterans of the Grande Armée, men who marched from Spain to Moscow, they talk about Napoleon's victories with awe. They call it the tactical miracle, but the tone shifts dramatically in the later years.
How so?
They describe conquering liberated cities in places like the German states where the local merchants looked at the French soldiers with cold resentment.
So he had the tactical brilliance to conquer, but he failed to win the hearts, or more importantly, the wallets of the conquered people.
The economic consequences were brutal. Napoleon imposed the continental system, a massive, forced economic blockade designed to defeat Britain by crippling its trade.
And that policy effectively strangled the very vassal states and forced allies he claimed to be liberating.
It did. You simply cannot feed a continent on glory alone. Markets need to breathe and trade needs to flow. His entire foreign policy, designed to centralize power around Paris and punish an external foe, Britain, ultimately starved the economic foundations of his own empire. The peace they imposed felt like a slow-motion collapse.
And beyond economics, the human cost eventually reached a sociological breaking point back in France, right? The public's enthusiasm for endless glory eventually gives way to just pragmatic exhaustion.
It did. The charismatic fire burns out when the cost becomes too high. If you look at records from provincial France around 1814, you see this profound shift. For 20 years, villages had sent their sons off to war. At first, it was about trophies and grandeur.
But by 1813, 1814,
they were drafting the Marie-Louise's teenagers, some barely 16, because all the men of military age were gone or dead.
the political aim shifted from expansionism to simple survival.
The villagers stopped caring about controlling the Rhine or the Vistula. They desperately wanted a domestic peace and an economy that wasn't taxed to oblivion to fund the next war.
And that desire for domestic stability, not another grand war aim, became the ultimate check on the strongman's ambition.
The final, undeniable check. Once Napoleon lost his massive army in the disastrous 1812 Russian campaign, the Sixth Coalition formed in 1813 and decisively defeated him. Facing mass casualties and economic ruin, the French population readily accepted the return of Louis VIII in 1814, who focused explicitly on economic recovery and a constitutional monarchy.
The political will to fight for the strongman just vanished because he was no longer delivering on that promise of security and stability.
It was gone.
You know, that failure tactical brilliance without long-term political stability is such a recurring theme. It brings us forward to the Korean War and the famous Incheon landing in 1950. It's lauded as this operational masterstroke, but the sources argue its success tragically obscured a massive strategic failure.
Operation Chromite at Incheon was, from a purely military standpoint, one of the most audacious and brilliant amphibious landings in history. The audacity, the synchronization, the successful navigation of extreme tidal variations and high seawalls, it was an undisputed military victory.
It relieved the besieged Busan perimeter and recaptured Seoul. A huge win.
A huge win, but its success masked this deep policy confusion.
What was the policy goal before Incheon?
Well, the initial policy goal set in the summer of 1950 was limited, simply preventing the North Korean attack from succeeding and restoring the 38th parallel status quo.
But the political environment back home in the U.S., dominated by the fear of losing Korea after losing China, that quickly made the war aims ambiguous and expansive.
Exactly. The Truman administration was internally divided on whether to unify the peninsula or stick to a limited war aim.
So what did they do?
The core document meant to define the strategy, the National Security Council Report 811, published just 6 days before the Incheon landing, was what the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Bradley called a masterpiece of obfuscation.
A masterpiece of obfuscation. I love that.
It simultaneously stated that military actions north of the 38th parallel were beyond the accomplishment of this mission, and that the UN commander was authorized to conduct operations north of the 38th parallel to pursue a rollback strategy.
So it was a document designed to please everyone and commit to nothing.
Precisely. And because the political objective was so ambiguous, the spectacular tactical victory at Incheon tragically inverted the strategic process. The success created an environment of overconfidence, what you might call a catastrophic victory, that supplanted policy goals with military objectives.
The administration was so overwhelmed by MacArthur's operational success that they essentially relinquished control over strategic decision-making.
They did. That's a crucial failure of leadership. Secretary of Defense Marshall explicitly told MacArthur, "We want you to feel unhampered tactically and strategically to proceed north of the 38th parallel."
That permission was the strategic disaster.
It was. The military success dictated subsequent strategic aims, leading directly to mission creep and a forceful push toward the Yalu River, which disregarded all the principles of caution regarding the Chinese and Soviet borders.
It reminds us of a core Clausewitzian truth. The strategist must define an aim for the entire operational side of the war in accordance with its political purpose.
And when leaders fail to define clear policy, they often fail to account for the consequences of success. Incheon's victory created the conditions that allowed MacArthur to feel unhampered, directly contributing to the massive Chinese intervention that dramatically prolonged and escalated the war.
The failures of strategy in the 20th century, then, were deeply informed by this profound shift in how leaders and analysts viewed conflict.
Yes, the study and practice of war moved away from the realm of the aristocratic warrior statesman toward what has been termed the managerial age.
So strategy stops being about character and political will and starts being seen as a systems problem, something solvable by optimization.
That's right. So John Hackett observed this as a big jump in the application of business techniques to military problems, accompanied by increased professional specialization and rationalization.
The theory of the managerial revolution.
Articulated by thinkers like James Burnham. It suggested that a new ruling class technical experts, bureaucrats, policy planners emerged after World War II, focused on administration and optimizing outcomes rather than just, leadership.
And this managerial mindset deeply influenced Cold War strategic thought, especially regarding nuclear deterrence.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Bernard Brodie, Thomas Schelling, and Herman Kahn, they translated strategic thought into a language of control variables, escalation ladders, and cost-benefit equations.
The whole goal shifted dramatically.
It did. As Brodie put it in The Absolute Weapon, the purpose of military forces was no longer defined by winning wars, but by managing and averting them through complex deterrence models. War became a problem of game theory and risk management.
And Robert McNamara became the poster child for this approach during the Vietnam War.
He personified the hubris of the managerial class. As a former Ford executive, McNamara approached the war as a budgetable, predictable, problem-solvable through systems analysis. He relied on endless Baroque metrics like counting pacified hamlets or measuring body counts.
Believing that escalation could be micromanaged through a controlled application of force and rational modeling.
Exactly, but the complexity of Vietnam, the culture, the political will of the adversary, that couldn't be reduced to quarterly progress reports.
No.
It delivered an epistemic humiliation to the managerial paradigm. The defeat showed the brutal limits of treating war as a purely technical systems problem. It was a failure of political vision, not just process.
Yet the managerial class often responded by refining the process, seeking better metrics, faster analysis, rather than fundamentally abandoning the techno-rationalist paradigm.
Yes.
And that leads us directly to the modern pursuit of game-changing technologies, whether it's high-energy lasers or sophisticated drones. We keep chasing the technical solution. But does technological innovation automatically produce a strategic advantage?
It leads us repeatedly into what we call the technicist fallacy. This is the error of believing that technical innovation automatically translates a tactical performance into a strategic effect.
It mistakes the technical instrumentation, the sophistication of the weapon for strategy,
which must always be rooted in clear political purpose and human intentionality.
Let's use laser weaponry as a case study. The technical advancements, especially in anti-drone systems like Israel's Iron Beam, are impressive. What makes them a tactical marvel but a strategically limited asset?
They are tactically revolutionary, especially for short-range defense. Lasers offer ultra-high speed, precision, and the critical advantage of being low cost per shot.
Right, a single interceptor missile from Iron Dome costs upwards of, what, $40,000 to $80,000?
Exactly. An iron beam shot requiring only electricity costs maybe $3. Against cheap, crude drone swarms or rudimentary rockets, that cost efficiency is economically transformative. It solves a tactical problem. How do you deal with mass, low-cost threats?
That sounds like a decisive advantage, though. Where do the strategic limitations creep in?
They are constrained by the laws of physics and the environment. Lasers suffer from atmospheric limitations because they are light waves. They cannot operate effectively in low visibility conditions like fog, heavy rain, dense smoke, or dust storms. Furthermore, they suffer from something called blooming, where heat and atmospheric particles scatter the beam, drastically limiting their power and range.
So the tactical marvel, the ability to fire at the speed of light, is fundamentally restricted by the tactical environment.
Exactly. The Iron Beam's estimated operational range is only about 2 kilometers, compared to the 20 kilometers plus of the Iron Dome missile system. A laser is a superb, cost-effective, tactical defensive instrument in clear weather, but its inherent technical limits prevent it from delivering the kind of massive, decisive strategic advantage that wins wars or shifts continental power balances.
And this dynamic brings us to the Red Queen's hypothesis, this constant evolutionary race without ever getting ahead.
The Red Queen's race means that technology success only accelerates an endless, costly cycle of adaptation. If you invent a highly effective laser defense, your adversary doesn't stop. They counter-adapt.
So they might deploy drones that use heavy electronic countermeasures, or just use smoke screens to block the laser.
Or fog, or drone swarms, designed to overwhelm the laser's heat dispersal capacity. You run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. The strategic landscape hasn't changed. The cost of operating within that landscape has simply skyrocketed.
It locks both sides into a treadmill.
A treadmill. Each tactical gain forces a counter-adaptation. The technological advancement is merely running in place to avoid extinction, not achieving a lasting war-winning advantage. Strategy is inherently political and intentional. It requires political actors to choose what victory looks like. The technicist fallacy negates that intentionality.
Treating technology as the independent variable that drives strategy, when in reality, technology is merely the servant of political purpose.
Well said.
The ultimate expression of this techno-dynamism today is drone warfare. What does the rise of drones tell us about the character of modern conflict?
Drones represent the next phase of the information-based revolution in military affairs, or RMA. They are, in one sense, the kinetic expression of cyberspace.
Miniaturization and low cost are their key defining features. We are now seeing a $500 FPV drone successfully immobilizing a $10 million Russian tank in Ukraine.
That cost asymmetry fundamentally changes the calculation of risk and capability. It enforces an era of precise mass, where large numbers of uncrewed systems are deployed, changing the character of war dramatically, from outer space surveillance down to subsea operations.
The ability of Ukraine to use drones to destroy irreplaceable Russian long-range bombers deep inside Russia shows the dramatic operational reach that cheap, pervasive systems now possess.
Drones allow small, technically proficient actors to project power and strike deep into the enemy logistical and strategic depth.
But the critical question, which echoes throughout this entire conversation, remains: will the ultimate determinant in war be the drone on the scene with the gun, as some technologists might argue?
Or will the core strategic and political factors, The adversary's will to fight, their underlying ideology, the clarity of the political aims, still temper the technological advantages, just as they did in Vietnam. The strategy must still be political. The drone, like the laser, is a new means, but its true strategic value,
whether it contributes to victory or merely accelerates the Red Queen's race,
is defined entirely by the political ends it serves. If the political objective is vague, no amount of drone sophistication will make the war successful.
Okay, we need to connect the lack of domestic accountability in backsliding states, which we discussed earlier, with the most dangerous form of foreign conflict, the emerging threat of limited nuclear war.
Yes, LNW. It seems like the most extreme version of the strongman's willingness to take risks.
How do limited nuclear weapons play into the autocratic calculation?
They are, quite simply, the ultimate instruments of stalemate, and more cynically, the ultimate weapons of the weak. For autocratic leaders, staying in power is paramount. Conventional military defeat is virtually synonymous with regime change and likely death or imprisonment.
So when they're facing a conventionally superior opponent, like the US or NATO,
they have an enormous incentive to use a first strike LNW to force a stalemate or compel the enemy to disengage.
Define LNW for us, because the very concept sounds like controlled suicide. How do strategists even define limited?
Conceptually, LNW is defined as the controlled and restricted use of low-yield nuclear weapons. We're talking LYNWs, typically ranging from 0.1 to 20 kilotons, for highly limited military or political objectives confined to a relatively small geographical space.
And the doctrine behind this is often called escalate to de-escalate.
Yes. A limited strike to signal your willingness to go higher, hoping the other side backs down because they are more risk-averse to vertical escalation.
Right. So the conventionally superior opponent, the U.S. in most modern scenarios, is expected to be more concerned with avoiding an all-out nuclear exchange than the autocratic regime fighting for its survival.
The strongman bets that their willingness to risk nuclear war is higher than the democratic state's willingness to accept it.
But the enormous dilemma, and the source of instability, is convincing the enemy that your first strike is truly limited and not the first step toward planetary war. How can a strongman manage that escalation to signal restraint?
The feasibility of LNW rests heavily on controlling the destructive outcome to signal limited intent and adherence to principles of restraint. There are two specific technological and doctrinal approaches that facilitate this signaling. The first is the use of so-called clean bombs.
What does a clean bomb imply in this context?
Conceptually, these are devices engineered to derive a much higher energy yield from the fusion part of the nuclear reaction, which significantly limits the resulting radioactive fallout and long-term waste.
So by using a clean bomb exclusively on military targets, the leader signals restraint by causing less collateral damage and civilian suffering,
making the strike appear more proportional to the military objective. The goal is damage to the enemy's military capability without catastrophic destruction to the territory or population.
And the second approach to signaling restraint?
The use of a nuclear EMP attack, an electromagnetic pulse. This involves detonating a nuclear device in the upper atmosphere. The primary destructive output is a massive electromagnetic pulse that disables the enemy's electronic infrastructure, communication systems, and military networks, often over an enormous geographical area.
But without mass casualties or physical destruction on the ground.
Exactly. A high-altitude EMP attack is non-lethal and minimizes physical destruction. It delivers a massive strategic shock that compels behavioral change, crippling the ability of the conventionally superior force to coordinate, while technically fulfilling the IHL goal of limiting unnecessary suffering.
It's a massive shot designed to force a political concession without crossing the traditional threshold of mass incineration. That is a terrifying application of technology.
It is. A way to break the nuclear taboo while signaling that you haven't totally taken the gloves off.
What is a scenario where an autocratic power might execute this?
Russia is frequently cited as a theoretical example, given its autocratic nature, lack of domestic accountability, and its diverse arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons.
Okay.
Consider a hypothetical jab-and-grab scenario in the Baltics, where Russia achieves quick conventional superiority, but NATO intervention is imminent. Russia, fearing a decisive conventional defeat, might execute a clean LYNW strike on a forward U.S. airbase.
That strike would be designed not to win the war, but to end it immediately by forcing a political calculation.
The goal is to demonstrate the escalate to de-escalate strategy, and the threat here is magnified by strategic deterrence gaps. The U.S. reduced its non-strategic nuclear weapons arsenal by 90% between 1991 and 2009.
Which hampers the U.S.'s ability to retaliate in a similar tit-for-tat fashion.
Precisely. Faced with a limited nuclear strike, NATO might vacillate because a vertical escalation using higher-yield U.S. strategic weapons could be seen as disproportionate to the limited Russian action.
So the U.S. and NATO, having many limited stakes globally and being politically constrained by democratic accountability, are inherently more risk-averse than an autocratic state whose regime survival is tied to the conflict outcome.
Absolutely. The strongman's lack of accountability enables the maximum risk. We know that even during the Obama administration, advisors discussed the possibility that the U.S. might choose conventional retaliation and economic isolation over a nuclear response if Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon on NATO troops.
And that calculation validates the autocrats' core gamble. What about the small nuclear powers?
The incentive applies even more dramatically to leaders like North Korea. When backed into a corner and facing imminent conventional defeat, where the U.S. or South Korea has broken through their defenses, the autocratic leader might use a LY&W to break the nuclear taboo.
As Henry Kissinger argued, smaller nuclear powers have less to lose.
Their goal is to maximize the political impact of their limited resources, forcing a status quo antebellum to avoid regime change. For the cornered autocrat, the potential strategic breakthrough or forced stalemate is worth the inherent terrifying risk of escalation.
Let's turn back to conventional strategy and one of the recurring, most expensive failures of modern foreign policy. Security Force Assistance, or SFA, the training, advising, and equipping of foreign military and police forces in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Mali.
Right.
Why do these forces, trained and equipped by the U.S. and its allies, consistently collapse the moment advisors leave, often despite massive investment?
It is the ultimate expression of the managerial failure we discussed earlier, mistaking tactical output for strategic success. SFA efforts are consistently measured by input measures, numbers of battalions trained, equipment delivered, or training days conducted. These are not strategic outcomes.
It's bean counting masquerading as strategy.
Exactly. Clausewitz warned that activity without strategy is merely noise in the fog of war. SFA often drifts into this fog, substituting these easily quantifiable technical metrics for clear political objectives. This creates what we often call Fabergé egg armies.
A Fabergé egg army, beautifully constructed, exquisitely equipped, but hollow and fragile.
They are technically proficient, sometimes highly equipped, but brittle. They shatter because they are not nested within viable political settlements, institutional absorption capacity, or clear political strategy. The problem isn't poor training methods, it's a profound conceptual failure.
Rooted in treating SFA as a purely technical, value-neutral service export, divorced from the political order it supports.
Yes, but SFA is never politically neutral. Training a foreign army is inherently a political act.
Never neutral.
Attempting to render SFA apolitical is itself a political decision that often inadvertently reinforces regime stability without strategic alignment or democratic legitimacy. In reality, partner militaries are often extensions of elite bargains, corruption, and patronage networks, not instruments of selfless national defense.
So the U.S. trains an army to be loyal to the nation, but the generals and commanders are often loyal to a corrupt political faction or an ethnic group.
That's the strategic vacuum. Look at the rapid collapse of the Iraqi army in Mosul in 2014. That was the predictable consequence of years of politicized SFA. The forces were hollowed out by sectarianism and patronage under a dysfunctional political order that lacked the will or capacity to govern effectively. The troops lacked the political incentive to fight for a regime they didn't believe in.
And the same applies in the Sahel, like Mali.
In Mali, the assistance created isolated islands of capability among elite units that immediately faltered when advisors left. Why? Because those elite units were not connected to a viable state structure or a deep-seated national purpose. The tactical skill was there, but the political foundation was sand. The military is never separate from the politics of the regime it serves.
That focus on political realism brings us to a crucial counterpoint: the war in Ukraine, which offers a different model that has been termed reverse SFA.
The Ukraine model is transformative because the starting condition was fundamentally different. Unlike in Iraq or Afghanistan, where Western aid tried to manufacture institutions on weak foundations, Ukraine entered the war with a hardened, clear national purpose.
A clear political end state of resistance and survival. They had the political will already.
They did. So instead of the donor defining the strategy, the recipient Ukraine defined the strategy, and the donor adapted their assistance to fit those needs.
Exactly. The Ukrainians adapted Western assistance to their own strategic reality, improvising under fire and modifying doctrine and contact. Western advisors helped restructure logistics and command, but the Ukrainians were the true strategic architects.
And they demonstrated resilience that forced the West to adapt its own training and weapons deliveries. That is the essence of reverse SFA, where the recipient shapes the war and teaches the donor strategic adaptation.
So for SFA to be successful, it must begin with political realism. It has to recognize that forces are embedded in regimes, and success comes not from tactical brilliance, but from a steady, politically informed approach that aligns military objectives with clear, viable political ends.
We must start measuring success in battalions trained or equipment delivered, and start measuring it in political military outcomes achieved and institutional cohesion fostered within a viable political settlement. The political goal must come first, always.
We've journeyed from the 19th century strongman who leveraged external fear for internal control through the economic and sociological limits that inevitably toppled his empire. We saw how tactical brilliance at Incheon can fatally obscure strategic incoherence, and how modern strategic thought has dangerously succumbed to the managerial revolution and the technicist fallacy, chasing high-cost technology that only accelerates the Red Queen's race.
Right.
And finally, we looked at the existential dangers of limited nuclear warfare, where the autocrat's lack of accountability at home enabled the riskiest foreign policy abroad.
The thread connecting all these disparate areas, from Napoleon's conquest to the failure of SFA, is the enduring lesson that strategy is fundamentally political. Whether discussing a backsliding executive or the risk of L&W, the technical, tactical, and technological brilliance, the lasers, the precision systems, the organizational charts, it's all rendered useless, or worse, counterproductive, if the underlying strategic political purpose is unclear, contradictory, or absent.
Political will, not technological novelty, ultimately dictates the success or failure of great endeavors.
The focus must always be on linking peculiar means to achievable political ends, because politics remains the absolute master.